Thanks, Ahmed. So actually, Asif Ghazenfar was supposed to come to this workshop and give a talk, but unfortunately he had to cancel. So because of the late timing, and yeah, many travel things going on. So now you're going to hear about mechanistic theory of foraging, whether you like it or not. Um, yeah, this is work that Ahmed and I did together on foraging, and so foraging behavior is ubiquitous. It's performed by many different animals in many different contexts, including humans. As we saw the example Nina showed, humans going to the buffet. You get encounter animals doing foraging in many places, such as this video that actually Ahmed took in, was this the New York City subway? Yeah, this is a rat who found a very good find, this giant piece of pizza. But you see at the end, the rat drops the piece of pizza, and it's standing there at the bottom looking back, and it's making the decision, decided, should I go back for this piece of food? This is a very good piece of food. Or is this risky? Should I go on and look for other food in the environment? So see, here's a behavior that actually involves many different components, including threat monitoring system, the reward system, how satiated am I, aspects of spatial memory, going back to certain food sites, and then of course foraging decisions. So this is really a task that animals need to perform. It's ecologically relevant, and it's something that we can start to ask, how do environmental factors affect neural processing and decision making? So today I'm going to talk about our work, this mechanistic model of foraging decisions in an evidence accumulation framework. And then I'm going to talk about some places that we want to go with this and other related questions that we want to answer. So first I'm going to talk about I'll talk about our model. So the problem we're considering is the patch leaving problem, which is a canonical foraging task. The question is when to leave one research patch in search of another. So here we have some patches in the environment, and the animal would be here going between patches. And really what the behavioral observables are the patch residence time, how long you stay in a single patch, the travel time, how long you're taking to travel between patches, and the food intake, the food you're taking in the patch. So this is actually, so now I've said the environment exists in patches, animals traveling through it, but in many cases this is actually a very good description of the animals, what they're doing in the natural environment. So I'd like to show you some examples from my colleagues at Max Planck for Animal Behavior, who are looking at a comparative study with several different species foraging for the same resources. This study is done on Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. So these are different species, spider monkey, capuchin monkey, kinkajou, and coati, and they're all essentially sharing for the same food sources. So at this time of the year, these trees called the tonka bean tree were in bloom, and conveniently they have these nice pink flower blossoms when they're in bloom. So using a drone, you can fly over and actually map the locations of all these tree resources across the entire island. And then from using GPS tracking, we can track the movement of an animal on the landscape. So this is a movement of a coati. You see it's actually right here. This is sped up really a lot. So the animal's moving in the landscape, stopping on a tree for some time, stopping on some more than the others, moving from one to the other. It's staying on this one for a while. Now it's moving around, searching some more. Now this is the same animal. Now it's zoomed out a bit more and looking at over time. So we can see this animal is tending to go back to a certain places more than others. Here, and here. It keeps doing this over time. If you look at a different animal, so this is a coati. So now this is long-term tracks of a capuchin monkey. There, it's actually on the same island, but this is just a different section. And this is pretty zoomed out because you see now these trees appear smaller. So this animal is tending to really like to go right here, but then in a bit it will change from going around in this area and start to explore more in this area. And all the time it is stopping occasionally in this. This is really sped up a lot.
What's the amount of time that's
Actually, I can't tell you an exact scale. This was probably over, this is definitely less than the course of a day.
Okay.
Probably the scale of hours to maybe a whole day. So we can actually look at this. This is the same type of video shown from the different species, and I'll pause it at the end here. So in all of these, we can see the resource maps, and we see these different animals that are using for the same resources are actually moving around, and they're stopping in the different resource patches and then moving around and exploring quite differently. So from this type of data, we can see how long they're staying in a resource patch and then moving between patches. We can also observe individual animals on how the resources are actually taken within the patch. And this was data collected by Grace Davis, who's also at Knox Planck for animal behavior. So here's two different capuchin monkeys. This is a different time of year, so now the palm trees are in season. So here's two different animals. This monkey seems to hit the jackpot. This is a ton of fruits on this tree, and here is the cumulative rate of food intake over time for two individuals. And this line is actually the optimal predicted by the marginal value theorem, which I'll mention on the next slide. And we can compare here the food intake rates compared to what would be an optimal, or approximately optimal strategy. So now let me come back to the patch leaving problem. I've showed you some examples where we can actually observe the patch residence time, travel time, and the food intake. To me, this motivates considering this as a theoretical problem, because this is a problem that animals are really actually solving in their environment in many different cases. So there's been a lot of previous work considering the patch leaving problem. Probably most well known is the marginal value theorem, which says that you can optimize intake rate by leaving the patch when the reward rates reach the overall average for the environment. And this is indeed actually what's compared to here. This would be the optimal leaving time predicted by the marginal value theorem, and this is how long the animal stayed. So in many of these cases, they're staying slightly longer than the marginal value theorem. Now there's been other work on the patch leaving problem, considering what if we have discrete instead of the continuous rewards that are considered by the MVT. Also means to estimate available energy in the environment. And so importantly, the marginal value theorem predicts a rule for when you should leave the patch, but it doesn't say how you use your experience of gaining rewards and your experience in the patch to actually decide when you should leave the patch. So there has been other mechanistic accounts. So the model I'm going to show and our approach is to combine aspects from these different theoretical frameworks into a single model where we can start to ask questions about how the strategies change with the environments, or how different animals may implement different strategies, and what may be some of the neural substrates or neural computing mechanisms in different areas of the brain implementing these decisions. So we call this model the foraging drift diffusion model, and it's parameterized as shown here. That we have a patch which has food in chunk sizes of C, so C goes to 0 would be continuous rewards, so C increases, this becomes more discrete. Its patches has some size, an area, and they have an initial density of food. There's some travel time between the patches also. So these are the environmental parameters. And then the basic model is two coupled equations, one for performing a moving average of the energy in the environment. So this is the direct experience of the reward the animal is getting, and this is a metabolic cost. And then we have the decision to leave the patch, which is governed by a drift diffusion process, which, as Jan talked about earlier, is, well, in this case seems to be a pretty good way to represent, and we can discuss, I hope we continue to discuss this more as I show the results. So how this works, here's a patch decision variable. And when we reach a threshold, you decide to leave the patch. Here's a drift rate, and we have some noise too. So here's shown here, we have drift towards the threshold. This is the decision variable normalized by the threshold, so it would be leaving at 1. And we can solve this by either simulating this and sampling stochastic differential equations, or can solve it in Fokker-Planck formulation for here showing the probability density of the patch decision variable. So here's the food rewards, and I see a tick down in the patch decision variable. So key things to highlight here is we have these environmental parameters, but in the model here we have a drift rate and the threshold. So I'm wondering how we can set these parameters. So we can set these by using an approximation of the average energy. We can solve for a relationship between the threshold and the drift rate that yields optimal decisions. Then this relationship is actually a linear relationship, and it's in terms of the other environmental parameters, which are the average energy in the environment, metabolic costs, and the initial density of food in the patches, kind of the patch quality. But however, along this, when this relationship is satisfied, decisions will always be optimal according to the marginal value theorem. So we can choose alpha, we can choose the drift rate alpha and the threshold eta anywhere along this line, not including here, because this can lead to some multiple threshold crossings, so we leave out this area. So we can have decisions, parameter spaces here, which is an increment-decrement strategy, and I'll show this on the next slide. I think it'll become more clear. Or in this range, which is a decremental strategy. So actually, what do I mean by this? Increment-decrement strategy is we have drift always going to the threshold, but then receiving food makes you go away from the threshold. So here, drift towards the threshold, receive food reward, and this pushes you down away from the threshold. And if we change the signs, now we have a negative threshold. Here again, we're still having drift towards the threshold, but now food reward is also pushing you towards the threshold. So these strategies differ. They would both can achieve optimal energy intakes, but they differ in how the receipt of food reward affects your decision to stay in the patch. Because in an increment-decrement strategy, finding food makes you more likely to stay in the patch, because here it's pushing you away from the decision boundary. And in a decremental strategy, food makes you more likely to leave the patch, because it's pushing you towards the decision boundary. And so an increment-decrement strategy is optimal when the amount of food in the patch is unknown. And we showed this theoretically by considering a distribution of patch food densities, where the agent only knows the average food density, the average initial patch food density in the environment, but there's some distribution. And here there's uniform travel time between patches. So here I'm comparing these two strategies, which are called density adaptive, which is the optimal strategy when you have which is an increment-decrement strategy that is optimal when we have some distribution of patch food density, and robust counting, which is what I showed on this slide here, which is a decremental strategy. Compare the energy obtained and the patch residence times. So let's look at this one. This is the amount of time you're staying in the patch as a function of the patch food density. And so what the marginal value theorem predicts is this dotted line here, is that you should stay in better patches longer. This is because it takes you longer to deplete them to the same rate. And if we use an increment-decrement strategy, we see this trend, both approximately, and we can solve for an approximate analytical solution, and we can simulate this with noise added also. And why you do this with the increment-decrement strategy is food pushes you away from the boundary. So if you're in a better patch, you don't actually know the quality of the patch, but you're receiving more food rewards, so you're more likely to stay longer. However, if we take a decremental strategy, we see the opposite trend. The decremental strategy is like a counting strategy. So if you're in a patch with higher food density, you actually stay less time with this because it takes you less time to get the same amount of rewards in the patch. So in this environment, if we take the increment-decrement strategy, we have optimal behavior, bars of first noise. And if we take a counting strategy, we have suboptimal behavior. We're staying in the patches. There's a large variance, very large variance in how long we're staying in the patches. Okay, now let's consider a different environment. So now, here considered continuous rewards. Now let's consider, what if we have discrete rewards and patches are scattered, so travel time between patches is drawn from an exponential distribution. However, in this environment, all the patches have the same number of food items, and it's a discrete number. So in this strategy, an optimal strategy is to exploit the knowledge you have about the environment, which would be that each patch contains a set number of food items, say 4 or 5, and that you should leave after you find a certain number of food items. So in this environment, a counting strategy is optimal. Counting strategy is a decremental strategy, I mean. So here, this decremental strategy performs better, has a higher energy intake than a increment-decrement strategy. And I'll note that this is actually higher than predicted by the marginal value theorem, because the marginal value theorem assumes a rate, which comes from a continuous reward, and here we don't have continuous reward, we have discrete rewards. So this is actually slightly higher, because with this strategy you tend to leave immediately after the receipt of a reward. So I've compared these strategies to optimal, but the most common observation experimentally is that animal decisions are not optimal. So we wanted to think about how can we incorporate this into the same modeling framework. So some possible mechanisms that have been suggested are satisficing, where you change your, where you just try to maintain an energy intake above some threshold, say. You don't really need to optimize, you don't really try to optimize food intake, you try to stay over, say, a survival or a satiation threshold. Or another mechanism could be temporal discounting, where you value current rewards more than future rewards or expected future rewards. So we incorporated this model using really a satisficing mechanism that's represented by a marginal utility function. So we have a marginal utility, which is some function that we can choose. That's a function of the energy of the environment. So if the energy environment is low, then it's probably close to the energy that animal needs to survive. So it's going to be very important to actually take an optimal strategy. So low energy, we'd expect to be very close to optimal, and there should be a high utility of obtaining more food. However, if there's plentiful environment, lots of food, then it's lower utility of obtaining more food. So one way to model this is putting in, choose a form for the marginal utility function, here using an exponential form. So here, with beta, here is a satisficing parameter. Beta equals 0 would correspond to the model I showed previously with optimal decisions. And non-zero beta corresponds to suboptimal decisions via this satisficing mechanism. So here I can plot average energy intake and patch residence times predicted by the model when we put in this satisficing mechanisms. And this would be the optimal energy, here's energy, which would be optimal, and this curve is optimal. And here's the patch residence time, that would be optimal. And here's plotted actually from the model and the simulations. So we see here we have suboptimal energy intake and longer than expected patch residence times. But due to the form of the utility function, we see that as this approaches 0, 0 is the survival threshold in this model, then behavior becomes near to optimal. And with patch residence times, we generally have patch residence times longer than optimal, but as this goes towards here 0, then these become very near optimal. So now I've shown you this model. I want to talk about some other things we want to do with this and other questions we want to ask related to foraging and related to also the questions brought up by this model. So one thing in this, we assumed a decision heuristic, which is, here I used a drift diffusion process, which is an evidence accumulation to threshold process to make a decision. And I compared it to the marginal value theorem. There's some limitations of that because it seems close to optimal, but it's A different approach is to step back and ask how would a Bayesian observer approach the question of inferring the patch quality and the current rate of food intake, especially when it's non-continuous rewards and uncertain environment, and then how would this observer decide to leave the patch? So we've been taking this approach, work with Zach Kilpatrick. We showed this at a poster on Cosyne on Friday, which you might have seen. Taking this the patch quality inference problem, the patch leaving as the inference problem, and trying to define some theoretical basics and some situations to compare to. So the problem that we're considering here is very similar to the problem setup I showed in the other part of the model. We have some patch food density, we have some food encounters, but now we have an observer belief that's updated about the current patch. So in this case, we're considering some idealizing limits in order to establish theoretical bounds in these idealist cases and then relax these assumptions. So this is current work, which we hope to have a preprint published in the next month or so. And if you're really interested in this, Zach Kilpatrick would be the best person to talk to about this approach. So some other things we'd really like to look at is related to these data I showed near to the beginning, is where you see these animals are clearly revisiting certain places. So there's some aspects of route planning, spatial memory, perhaps memory of returning to previous patches and how much food reward is left there. So we'd like to think about how to, and also navigating the landscape, because you see that these patches they're not distributed in grid-like, and there may be also environmental features in the way. So we'd like to think about how to incorporate this into the framework, and particularly, can we make some predictions on how these strategies and the environment come in to have different expected behavior. For example, considering resource landscapes, intractable forms such as spatially inhomogeneous Poisson processes. Another avenue that we're currently starting to work on is extending this framework to social foraging decisions, such as those made by, here shown a troop of baboons, also active experiments going on in similar situations with baboons and foraging patches. So here, we're starting to work through this. If you delete this term, then it's the same model I just showed. So in a general framework could look something like, here we incorporate non-social information, which is a direct receipt of reward, and then we have social information. So we're currently working on to take this forward and ask of what may be cooperative or competitive foraging strategies, and then compare this to data that we're actually seeing animal groups doing on foraging landscapes. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Ahmed on this project, with this work we did together, and Zach Kilpatrick, who is currently working on the Bayesian inference model. Also Sylvia Gullery, who did some initial work on this project as part of the Woods Hole Methods Computational Neuroscience summer course that was directed by Mark Goldman and Michael Fee, and acknowledge colleagues at Max Planck for Animal Behavior, Shaheen and Grace, who provided this data that I've shown, and we were starting to work together, especially on these collective foraging problems. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and happy to take questions.
So very nice. I had one kind of general question about a lot of these approaches, and that is what the information, the local information available to the animal versus assuming global knowledge. So in the marginal value theorem, kind of you need to leave when your rate of intake equals the average rate across the environment. How does the animal know what is the average rate across the entire environment? Likewise, here you have average energy, or even things like this average travel time. How do you know that? Even if you have a good spatial memory and you've been for years in this environment, so you know generally where the trees are. I mean, and every given year, the distribution and then amount of food in each tree might differ. So essentially, you only have access to local information, not to global ones. So can you kind of explain how that works out?
Yeah, I can talk about this. So here we have we do have a moving average of the energy. So the animal, this is something I think the animal can compute by a moving average. Let me talk about these other patch parameters, because we have this parameters in the environment, the travel time and the initial density of the patches, and also the area and the chunk size of the patch. So I set this strategy which is based on these parameters. So in order to adopt this strategy, the animal would have to know the average return of patches in the environment and the average energy. However, the simulations show that if we use this estimate, it's pretty close. And this is the internal metabolic rate and also the area of the patch. So these are things the animal would have to know, or they could just infer, or they could just choose this. This is the optimal strategy based on the environment, so they could just choose this threshold without explicitly inferring the other patch parameters.
But I think the Bayesian inference model will be getting into this very particular problem, is that we will have a recipe for how the animal will learn these parameters from first principles. So
From what?
From first, like if the animal just entered an unknown environment, then we can see how they learn. So it is the learning question, yes, that he is getting into. So I think the Bayesian inference framework that we are developing now will get into some of these questions. So yeah, I agree with your concern, but I think we will.
That means that as the animal exposed to the environment, these numbers will change, because as you showed, the distribution of these purple trees is kind of very heterogeneous. So it'll initially explore an area with a lot of trees or a small number of trees, then it'll move to a richer or poorer environment area, and then this average energy will change a lot.
Exactly, because the behavior we are considering here is after the animal we didn't use any notion of exploration or exploitation here, beginning at the learning phase. So we say the animal have learned the environment, and then what we are working out now is how can we learn them, but which definitely a tougher question.
We'll say the key parameter to learn in this model here is the quality of food, average quality of food in the patches. The travel time doesn't come into this equation for the optimal. It comes into it really factors into this moving average of energy. So like this is really the one key parameter the animal needs to learn. Let's see, is that a question?
I think, Ahmed, you just said that there's no exploration exploitation in this model, but there's this parameter alpha, which you plug in, and it's kind of what is the drive of the animal to go, to explore, right? Because if alpha is 0, he'll never leave. He is like a greedy, he found the tree and he'll stay there until there's no more food left, right? So there is exploration exploitation in this one.
Yeah.
Alpha is actually the drift. So if these strategies, here is alpha equals 0, and the animal would leave.
Yeah, if it's negative,
if they find enough food,
then they'll just decrease until they leave. But
so
if it's positive, then it'll never.
So what happens? This is kind of a boundary of you have if you take this strategy with no drift, then you this strategy is actually can be optimal if you have no noise and you know the amount of food per patch, but it's very sensitive to noise.
Right.
So as soon as you add noise, then this is highly non-optimal. Or as soon as you have patches that we don't know the amount of food.
I was just gonna have I'm really intrigued by the Bayesian problem. So it sounds to me that it's a generalization of multi-armed bandit problem, right? Because if travel time was 0, then it would be multi-armed bandit, right? So you would have to be able to find some heuristic for solving this with the travel time.
So there's a few. The problem is similar to the multi-armed bandit, but it's generally not exactly the same. Hopefully I can remember these actual ways. One of this is this stay or go decision. The multi-armed bandit is you have a picture of different resource distributions, and you're going from one to the other, and you want to explore these, and you go back to these. So in the patch leaving problem, how it's formulated. Here you leave one resource, and what you may find next is uncertain. So if you would express this in the multi-armed bandit framework, this would be like an environment where as you leave one patch, then all the other ones are reset. As well as another difference is incorporating the travel time, as you mentioned. And the third difference of usual multi-armed bandit formulations is usually the multi-armed bandits formulations is you go to the one spot, you have some reward or not, go to the next one. So it's this kind of discrete time versus the patch leaving problem. The key question is how long do you stay in the patch? So there's extensions to multi-armed bandits framework that address those three different areas that make it different. But then if you incorporate all these, it's becoming a different decision problem.
No, but that's what I'm saying. It's a generalization of multi-arm. I mean, you can imagine.
Yeah, it is.
Probably more complex, but there's like you
Yeah.
can solve it by infotaxis because like infotaxis gives a good heuristic for solving.
Yeah, this would be an interesting way to think about it.
More questions?
Coming back to the issue of learning, is there actually evidence, if you look at the kind of tracks that you showed at the beginning, the amazing data, that initially the animals, the coatis or the capuchins, whatever, would explore, not stay so much, sort of map out the, the initial density of food, the average energy, all these things, can explore, you can map them out and only later exploit them. So is there evidence of something like this? In the data?
I don't know.
Because
We haven't analyzed this in the data yet. But this is a really interesting question. We have to start to think about this with the Bayesian inference model. Because you could actually have a strategy where you don't want to optimize food intake, but you want to optimize your information gain about the environment, which would not be optimizing food intake, but it'd be optimizing the information you have out. So it's something we want to be able to have some kind of predictions for from this normative framework. Good question.
You said that animals don't actually do optimal stuff. Have you looked at how they differ from the optimal? Do they stay longer, shorter? Is it a random difference?
The most common is longer, so the over harvesting, and actually the data showed that you can actually see this here because here would be, for example, here would be optimal, but this is actually how long they stayed in the patch. So some explanations for this are there's other costs to leaving and exploring, such as there's some danger of going out between costs.
Also just impulse control.
Okay.
Foods in front
In the interest of time, we can continue the discussion over the break. So we have 15-minute break, and then we're back to hear from Elad. And thank you, Jacob, again.